Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Halakha 101 class taught by Rabbi Rebecca Schatz.
So if you remember last week, we were talking about, hold on one second. We were talking about noten tamlif gam, so something that gives off like a gross taste or something that would be considered to be gross based off of how it is by accident added into a dish. We then happened upon the last seif, the last section that we happened upon, was all in Hebrew, and I ended up translating it in the moment, which I don't love to do because I want to make sure that you can actually see the words that we're reading, that we're learning. So I asked my teacher, Rabbi Aaron Alexander, this morning, where could I find a good English translation of Yorah Deah, which is the section of the Shulchan Aruch that we're in, and he said nowhere, and I said, okay, great. I found some moderately good translations for today, and then I'm going to reevaluate after today's class whether or not I want to kind of jump out of this section of Kashrut and jump into the Orach Chaim section, because that will be more translated into English. Not to say that I couldn't put in my own work to do the translation, but I know that if every week it's going to be many seifim of me translating, I'm afraid that I'm not going to end up being able to keep up with what we're doing. So I want to make sure that we're learning in the best way possible, which I think for this crowd is to be using the English translation and not just the original. So I just want to give you that little statement, to start off, that we might not switch topics, but just might switch books next class. But for right now, we are still in Yorah Deah, and we are in Siman 122. And let me just pop it up here. And what I'm going to show you is not from Sefaria, because again, on Sefaria, it's just going to be in Hebrew. So I'm going to show you just a Google Doc that I made that has both the Hebrew/Aramaic and the English. And we'll look at some of these seifim together today. We are very much so in the weeds at this point in terms of this topic. We're getting into the very nitty-gritty aspects of kashering in terms of this idea of noten tamlif gam. Still under the assumption of something being made or assumed to be used by someone who is known to be an idol worshiper, so someone who is using the vessel for a different kind of use than we would use it. So here's the fourth seif, and we will put this in the podcast. All people can see the text I'm looking at, but we're at Siman 122, seif Daled, or 4. So we actually looked at this one a little bit last week, but I want to go over it because it's not particularly self-explanatory, and I want to make sure that we have this down before we go to the next one. So a pot that has absorbed both meat and milk, right? So something that has contained within it meat and milk, whether that means together or that means something, a meat pot, and by accident had milk go into it. If before a night has passed, so if 24 hours has not yet passed, so let's say 16 hours has only passed, a person heated water in it, it's counted as if you've again cooked the isur. So again, this is something we looked at last week, but just to reiterate, if you have a pot that you usually use for chicken soup, and you were making some kind of chicken soup, and by accident a drop of whole milk got into that chicken soup because on the other side of the kitchen you were filling a bottle or something like that, then that, actually it would have to be more than a drop, because a drop would be batel b'shishim. But let's say an entire bottle of milk ended up pouring into it. Now you've absorbed meat and milk together. And so even if you kashered it and you let it sit aside, if you didn't let it sit aside for more than 24 hours, it's as if when you put neutral water back into it, it's as if you've cooked again meat and milk together, even though the substance inside that pot is just water. Everyone with me so far on that? Okay.
Yeah, excuse me, Rebecca, what's an isur, please? So you probably have already done this in the past, and I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. Isur is just something that is asur, that is forbidden. So treif would be another word. I can change that here. So treif would be another word, or just something that you're not supposed to be eating. So it doesn't have to be like bacon, which is how we would, define treif, but it could be something that you're just not supposed to eat. So whether that's meat and milk together, or just a kind of meat that's not kosher, etc. So we count 24 hours from the time water was heated. So if you make this mistake and you do boil water in it, then from that point forward, we count the 24 hours. You can't start counting the 24 hours from when you made the mistake. Now, if you've made kind of a double mistake, you have to count the 24 hours from then. This is not the case with other isurim. So this is not the case with other things that you might do wrong. Here, just to drive Barbara crazy, the isurim is being used in a different context. So here it's being used in the context of something else that might be that might not be permitted, right? So we're not necessarily talking about isurim of food, but just like other types of isurim. It is also the case that if it's not basar v'chalav, right, if it's not meat and milk together, that's a very different kind of isur than if it's basar v'chalav together, because that's, the original mitzvah from the Torah. We good so far? Any questions on this? I know we went over it last week, but I just wanted to make sure it was clear. Okay. I just want to see what these chats are. Oh, sorry, Rachel. Hope you feel better. Refuah shlema. Okay. Okay, so a bit of an isur, a bit of something that is not that is not considered to be edible in a kosher way, absorbed in a vessel that isn't normally used for a bit of heter. They're using all these words. Sorry, permissible, right? So a bit of something that's permitted in order to impart this taste to the permitted thing, in order that they use it for a large kettle or barrel and so forth. Okay, so this is a very long run-on sentence. Let me try to break it down. So, a little bit of something that you cannot eat that's then absorbed into a vessel that you don't normally use, that sits in your drawer. You use it once in a blue moon. In order for the isur, right, in order for the thing that isn't permitted to then go into the thing that is permitted, you can use it from the outset, right? So if you don't use it for a long enough period of time, is basically what this is saying. It's as if that thing that is not allowed to be used or not allowed to be eaten is gone. Right, so I gave a long time ago, I gave an example of the china that I received from a family friend, and Rabbi Alexander said, oh no, you can totally use that china no matter what food had been on it, because it's been sitting in her cabinet for 25 years, right? So there's no way that anything, even if it's porcelain, even if it's ceramic, there's no way that it's continuing to how it says here, impart the taste, right? It's no longer giving off the taste of anything that could be treif or not supposed to be eaten. Yeah, Mike.
Doesn't that presume that the taste that is absorbed was not done through heat? If it was done through heat, wouldn't that mean that it have to be kosher if it could be, or disposed of? I can understand with a plate, but let's say it's a vessel that you cook in.
Yeah.
If you put something in it, if you put bacon in the pan, but don't heat it up, then that's this case. But if you were to heat it, I can't imagine that they would say that it's permissible to use it without koshering it first.
It's an interesting question, because in a few seifim we're actually going to get to things that are cold. So I wonder if here it's not making that distinction, though you're right that we would, our most stringent opinion would be that it would be harder to deal with a vessel that was utilized with heat in this kind of situation than one that, like the plates that I was referring to earlier, were used potentially with hot food on them, but not necessarily cooked in an oven on those particular vessels. It's a very interesting question. When they use the word kedei ra, it's often talking about like a pot that you would use on a stove. So my assumption is that they are talking about heat here.
Boy, I find that hard to believe that if the assumption is that the Isur material has actually been absorbed, then that means that heat was applied. And I would think that I find it hard to believe that there's a circumstance where you can continue to use it without koshering it.
So I do think that it's implying that you do kosher it. I'm just reading in the Hebrew to see if I can pick up anything that's not in the English. It's also possible that this is the case, but we don't hold by it, right? So, yeah, Bob, go ahead while I'm still reading in here to get to Mike's question.
Well, is maybe the key large kettle as opposed to the next sentence, but if it's a vessel that's used for small quantity, then it's forbidden to use it. In other words, it's clearly, large kettle clearly is something you cook in. A large barrel, doesn't strike me as something you cook in. That's a storage vessel. But then the next sentence has to do with small versus large. So, now, what it defines as small and large, clearly that's not, at least in English.
Yeah. That's why I'm looking at the thing with some of this Shulchan Aruch is that it repeats the same word over and over again, so it's hard to understand. So give me 1 second. Isur mu'at sheniv ala bekli darko shelo lehishtamesh bo beheter mu'at b'kedei sheyiten ze ta'am beheter kedei sheyishtamshu bo kmo keder kadola v'chayavat v'katsevahen hariza mutar. Yeah, so this seems to be saying up until here, even a little bit of Isur that was swallowed by the vessel, according to the way that it's used. Oh no, in a way that it's not typically used. So interesting. This could go back to what Mike is asking. Like if you were to use a pot that typically is used for hot, but you're using it with cold because that's not normally how you use it, or a kettle that you normally would use over heat, but now you're using over cold, which is the way that you wouldn't use it. But it seems to be saying that even if you use it in the way that you're supposed to, it's still permitted to use it lechatchila from the outset. You confused me, Mike. I hadn't thought about this until you asked the question. Let me just see if the actual Shulchan Aruch here has something specific on it, like any commentaries on it. It just tells me another place to look. Okay, so let me get back to this, Mike. It's a great question. It's not how I read it originally, so I hadn't looked up this question, since it's not how I understood it, but it's a really great point. And let me see what I can find on it. It's basically I'm looking in the original right now, and basically all of the places that I'm finding this particular halakha is saying, look in a different place. So I'll look in the different places and let you know what I find. Yeah, Bonnie, go ahead.
So you said that this is something that hadn't been used, like your china. So is there a certain length of time that it has to be not used?
Yeah, so basically anything longer than 24 hours is considered, for most types of vessels, is considered not parv, right? A meat pot doesn't go back to being parv, but as if it's not being used, and therefore had it been contracted with some other kind of food item, especially when we're talking about noten tam lifgam, right? A taste that was not wanted, or like food that got caked on there, it's as if it's no longer there. So the idea of ben yomo, which we see right here, this idea of it sitting for longer than 24 hours helps nullify A, the taste, and B, the mistake that was potentially made. Now, if you let something sit for 25 years, it just gets longer and longer and longer, and therefore more of that goes away. With glass, I talked about this a long, long time ago. With glass plates, if you didn't want to have multiple sets of plates, you could just have glass and just not use them within, 24-hour shifts of one another. So you could have a plate that you use for chicken one night and then a grilled cheese the next night, but it would have to be 24 hours.
But does that mean that if you had some pots, let's say you didn't keep kosher and you had pots from that time,
yeah,
you sat for a year or two, does that mean you could use them?
So you probably couldn't based on what they're made out of, but if they were made out of metal, which, I would assume back in the day it was not stainless steel like it is today, though probably were made out of different kinds of heavier metals. The idea of using that pot within 24 hours would be easier for the taste to be contracted because of the type of material. So your question is basically one of these questions that it just matters what it's made out of, and then you would answer the question. But it's possible is the answer. It just depends on how the pot is being used and what it's made out of. Yeah, Norm and then Marlies.
Certainly some old pots were heavy. I mean, cast iron, for example, is heavy. But I've also seen many pots, particularly older ones, that are really of a very thin kind of aluminum or something, base metal. So, very thin, relatively flimsy, not well balanced pots, and that people use, particularly people who aren't super well to do. And so I don't know that you could rely on it as having been heavy if they're old.
Yeah. No, I think that they were probably made heavier back in the day than they are. I mean, we have cast iron still today, I think I'm agreeing with you. I've said this many times. I don't know enough about the way in which vessels were made back in the day to say our pots, like those pots, would do the same thing. I can only speak to the pots that we use today and what they're made of and how we kasher them. But my guess is that to answer Bonnie's question based on your answer, Norm, is that this would only apply to certain kinds of pots based on their make, and not necessarily like all pots ever because of the way in which they're used. Does that make sense? Okay. Marlies.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned stainless steel, and that's something that cannot be koshered?
No, it can.
Oh, it can.
Yeah. Stainless steel can be koshered. Most any metal can be koshered. Cast iron, which I know is not the same as stainless steel, but cast iron is the one thing that people have a lot of question about in terms of kashering, because of the fact that most often it's seasoned and it has like a sealant on it of sorts. But pots, unless they have some kind of ceramic insert, can be very easily koshered.
So, like enameled cast iron would not be? Is that right?
So yes, but most likely the answer would be yes. It's hard for me to say yes without seeing it or knowing, but most cast iron and I shouldn't say anything. Most things enameled or cast iron cannot be koshered because they're porous materials.
Okay. So,
which is why many people who are big cast iron fans, don't wash them but season them so that they don't get the taste of the soap and whatnot into the actual cast iron. So if you're worried about something taking in a taste like that, then also you wouldn't be able to kosher it, because just like the idea of kevalo kach polto, it wouldn't be able to get out. If it can take it in, it wouldn't be able to actually get itself out.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let's keep going with this seif here, just so we can get to the end of it, and hopefully we can answer Mike's very baffling question. So it says here, aval imhu kli shemishtamshin, bo bedavar mu'at kmo ke'ara, which is like a big cauldron. What does it call it here in English? That says bowl. Okay. V'keyotze ba isur lehishtamesh bo she'ein mevatlin isur lechatchila. So if it's a vessel that you use for a very small quantity, such as a bowl, though a ke'ara is actually typically thought of as bigger. But for all intents and purposes, a ke'ara is like a bowl, like a mixing bowl. And anything like it. V'keyotze ba just means like anything in that category. It's forbidden to use it. Since we don't nullify, we don't cancel out, right? Mevatel is to cancel something out, or I'll just leave it at that. Isur lechatchila, so something that is not not permitted to be eaten from the outset. Afilo isur mu'at ve'afilo isur hablo'ah. So even something that was a little bit of isur, right, just a little bit of whatever that thing was, or something that was taken in as an isur based on the material that it went into, etc. So this makes me think that we are talking about heat, which again, going back to Mike's question, is really hard to believe, because you would imagine that something that is porous, that takes something in that is not kosher, you would not be able to then use without koshering. And it could be implied, and maybe that's what these sources are going to tell me, it could be implied that you are supposed to kosher it, or like the plates that I've had for, that came to me from a million years beforehand, even though they're not being used to cook, it's possible because they are porous items, they've been sitting for long enough that as if anything they've contracted is now tam lifgam, right, is a nasty taste, and so it wouldn't be considered something that's affecting that which is put on those plates any longer. Let's keep reading, because it's possible that more of this will be answered in the next pieces here. But keep that question, Mike, because though I think I might have answered it, I agree with you that it's interesting. Okay, I can't look at the Hebrew and the English at the same time on this one, but we're on number 6. We're on Vav. So if people are interested in looking at the Hebrew, A, it's on Safaria, and B, I can scroll up in a second. So vessels belonging to an idol worshiper fall under the legal presumption that they are not B'nai Yoman, meaning that they have not been sitting around for 24 hours. Therefore, if one transgressed and used them prior to making them suitable, the cooked substance is permitted. So therefore, if you didn't toivel them, right, we're getting back to this idea of toiveling for a second. If you didn't toivel them and you cooked in them, it's totally fine, because we assume that they've been sitting around for longer than 24 hours. And so to go back to the other seif, it's not great, but to go to this question of, are you supposed to kosher them or not? This allows us to imagine a world in which even if you didn't kosher, because they've been sitting for long enough, or at least longer than 24 hours, it's as if the taste that came into them is now pagum, is now disgusting, and it does not matter, and you're able to use the pot itself. Now, I know that some of you are thinking, is this the ideal situation? No, definitely not the ideal situation. You shouldn't try to make treif or try to mix meat and milk and think to yourself, I'll just put it on the shelf for 36 hours and I'll be totally fine. That you shouldn't try to do those things. But I do think, similar to a lot of the halakha that we're learning together, I do think that some of this shows us that there are leniencies, right? Or I shouldn't even say leniencies. There are rules that open us up to be able to experience a world of mistakes, right? A world of not being perfect in this practice and yet still keeping kosher, right? Yosef Karo is basically saying to us, if you make this mistake, it's totally fine, because you can assume that this hadn't been used in the past 24 hours. So even though, and Mike's totally right, even though we might not be comfortable with that, right, there is this element of, okay, well, even if it happens, it's going to be okay because of the situation of how long it's sat or where it potentially comes from, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to get to the Ramah in a second, which is the Ashkenazi opinion, but any questions on this little piece here? Oh, hi, Cora. I hadn't seen your face before. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Okay, so let's keep going. So the Ramah is the Rabbi Moshe Isserles. He's the Ashkenazi opinion. And he says if someone warms water in a vessel that had belonged to an idol worshiper with which to knead dough, it's forbidden to knead with that water since it's lechatchila. It keeps saying this phrase in English, which is means from the beginning, but it's talking about like from the outset, right? I should have changed that. Sorry, I didn't. Since the individual has not yet begun to gain benefit from it because he did not warm it to drink it. Okay, so let me just break this down here. So if you have a vessel of water, right, you're going to use it to maybe start the yeast or something in making your bread. and you put that water in a pot that you bought from someone who was not Jewish and who you believe potentially used it for other spiritual needs, you cannot use that pot, or you cannot use that which you were going to make bread out of from that pot, right? That pot is now no longer good to you, or I should say the pot is no longer good to you. The stuff that went into the pot is no longer good to you, because you haven't yet used that water for something. So it's as if the dough itself is being used as the first thing, and that's the problem. So this is a really silly one, but I'm trying to think of an example that's better than this, because this isn't how we make bread these days. The reason that this is a big issue in the Shulchan Aruch is because bread is a big issue. So I'm trying to think of something that would be better for the 21st century, that would give you a better example. Okay, Tybal, you have one?
I don't know. A complicated yogurt making?
Oh, that sounds even more complicated to me than bread. Maybe. Let's see what this. Let me see if this next piece makes it more clear, because I can see your eyes glazing over. So if this next piece doesn't make it more clear, I'll try to. Oh yeah, Mike.
Well, if you're looking for something that's similar but doesn't have the bread issue, what about a cake?
Yeah, but still, what would be the ingredient that
maybe it's a cake, a risen cake, that has yeast in it, but it's not a bread. You wouldn't make motzi on it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I'm just trying to think of what the equivalent would be to the water. Okay, well let's see if we.
What if you use juice?
Yeah, but to make what?
Bake stuff. I mean, I use juice a lot of times instead of water when I bake cakes.
That you heat?
Oh.
Well, okay, let's go to the second. I'm just trying to make it relevant to the 21st century, but I might not be able to. So let's try to understand it inside, and then I'll try to give an example. But something that was made for that purpose and not for the sake of something else, even though it belongs to an idol worshiper and a Jew can purchase it from them, from lechatchila, from the outset, it's permitted because it was made by the idol worshiper, and therefore it's b'diavad, it's after the fact. So if the vessel that you are using was made for the purpose of making bread, so I guess this does make it a little bit clearer. If you're not using a pot that wasn't created for the use of making bread, but was created for, I don't know, soup, right, or something that you use a pot for, then that's a different scenario, because even though it belonged to someone who could have used it for spiritual practices that we don't ascribe to, and we don't believe that vessel should be, quote, prayed over, it was made for that particular purpose, and therefore you're using it for the correct purpose. Okay, let's keep going. I think it's going to become more clear, though I feel like I'm losing you all. Nonetheless, it is forbidden to say, and you all keep laughing every time I say that, so I know I'm right. Nonetheless, it is forbidden to say to an idol worshiper, cook vegetables for me in your vessel, and similarly, one also cannot say to him, make me a brew, meaning like a stew or something. For anyone who says, cook for me, he is like one who actually cooked with his own hands, and it is possible that if it was made, I love this, by druggists, right? Made by people who are using it for some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not spiritual practice, but some kind of,
voodoo?
Potion.
Voodoo?
Potion. Who said potion? Yes, good job, Jeff. That's exactly what I was thinking of. Great. It is permitted because voodoo was a funny word though, because all specialized craftsmen set aside clean dishes for their work so that their craft won't be damaged. But a pious individual will be careful, for these things bring one to purity and to cleanliness. Okay, that last sentence is a lovely drash. I'm not sure that's very helpful. Okay, so this actually gets to an issue that has nothing to do with the dough above in the beginning of the Ramah here, but it gets to an issue that we actually deal with a lot in terms of often the opposite, in terms of us wanting something to be done and using a non-Jew to do it for us. This specifically comes up on Shabbat. That's not what they're talking about here. But for example, the only way that we can have coffee on Shabbat at Temple Beth Am is imagining that the non-Jew who is making the coffee for us on Shabbat also wants the coffee. Now, does Orlando want the 40 cups of coffee that he's making for Temple Beth Am? Absolutely not. Does he? That Orlando is making the coffee for himself and making extras for the rest of us. It just told me that my internet is unstable. Can you all still hear me? Okay. So let me move my phone. Maybe that will be helpful.
We lost you for a couple minutes.
Yeah, you froze for a little bit, Rabbi, but then you came back.
Oh, awesome. What was I talking about when I froze?
Orlando's coffee.
I think that what you're saying is that the way it works is if Orlando agrees to make some for himself, he's allowed to make extra.
Right.
Is that where you're going? But if he says it's all for the congregation, then it's not allowed. Is that what you were saying, maybe?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. I mean, what I said when I guess I cut off was that Orlando, by the way, Orlando's not the one who makes the coffee, but I love that we're using him as an example. Orlando makes the coffee with our intention that he is making for himself and extras for us. You are correct, Tybal, in saying that if he was just making coffee for Temple Beth Am, that wouldn't be okay. But it is okay for him to make coffee for himself and extras for us. So it's okay for us to get more than he is getting. So that's just a little bit of a caveat to what you mentioned, but that is exactly how it works. That is what's coming up here in this second part of the Ramah's comment, that I cannot say to somebody who uses this vessel in some kind of idol worship, can you please, because it's your vessel, cook vegetables for me? Because then it's as if I cook vegetables in that vessel, and that wouldn't be allowed, because that vessel needs to be toiveled before I can use it. It's not a vessel yet ready for me to eat something that I would consider to be kosher. So I think what it's getting at in terms of the dough, if I can just go back to that one for 1 second, and then Norm, I'll call on you, is that if the vessel itself was supposed to be used for making dough, it would be one thing to use it in that way. It's another thing to use like a pot that was supposed to be made for something, supposed to be used, for something else, and therefore make dough in it, because that somehow makes it seem as though you are not using the correct vessel for the correct thing, and it takes it to a whole different category of misuse. Again, when I said we're getting into the weeds, we're like really getting into the weeds, especially because in 2022, we're so not worried about this stuff that it's like hard to comprehend what an example would be, which is why I was having a hard time coming up with a non-dough example here, because we just don't buy vessels like this any longer, that we need to kind of figure out how to utilize them. And if you're worried about utilizing a vessel in the correct way, you probably toivel it anyway. So you're not dealing with this situation. Okay, Norm, and then Barbara, and then Renee.
I actually have two questions, but the principal one is this analogous to the fact we have a friend who planning to have a large group of people for dinner on the second day of Yontif. In mid-afternoon, we'll turn to somebody who's visiting and say, gee, I'm really in the mood to have a little of tzimmus, and proceed to make a huge pot of tzimmus, and then has, a little cupful, and the rest is set aside. It's going to be used for dinner that night. So she's able to say she's cooking on Yontif for that same Yontif, even though really she's primarily cooking for the subsequent Yontif. Yeah. Is this the same issue, basically?
It's not the same issue, but it's the same principle, if that makes sense. Meaning that's how you cook on Yontif, and it's a complete legal fallacy, right? Like none of us cook that way, and yet that's how you're supposed to cook for Yontif. Yeah.
Well, I know people who do that.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if I know from people who keep kosher who will go into a restaurant and order coffee or tea.
Yeah.
And the tea, I mean, they're eating it off of a cup that may have been used for treif soup or whatever, but obviously has been cleaned. And I mean, how does this all work?
So it's a great question, and it's possible that it's a similar principle to the one that we just talked about with the dough, actually. I'm not sure that they would be considered the same, but in terms of using a vessel for what it's used for, you don't have to assume that that cup was used for soup. It's only being used for coffee, in which case someone who's so my friend, Rabbi Josh Pernick, he'd probably kill me for telling you this story, but it's okay. He will go to any cafe and drink black coffee. He might, if he's going to drink coffee with milk in it, he might ask questions about the milk. I don't actually know, but he will drink black coffee in a cup, even if that place serves food, because he's not assuming that the cup is being used for anything but the coffee. So if we were to be in a home, or if you were to be in a place where you've seen them serve soup in those cups that they're also using for coffee, then you might have a question about it, or decide not to drink anything hot. But I do think that you might have just come up with a really good example for this dough example, in that if you don't think that it's what that vessel was once used for, then you can use it for that. If you do think it's the vessel that would be used for such a thing, then it's not permitted to you.
Even though when it's dirty, they're going to put that cup in the same sink filled with water with bona fide treif.
So that gets into a whole other conversation about dishwashers and cleaning, et cetera, et cetera. But as soon as something touches soap, it's as if it's pagum. It's as if it's gross. So now, yes, sure. Was it used with dairy in it, or was it used with meat in it? Maybe. But that thing that was in it is now considered gross, and therefore it's not going to contract to anything else. So dishwashers are complicated because of the filter, right? The drain, the filter. But sinks are not as complicated because everything's going down the drain and you're not eating out of a sink. That's why some people choose to have one sink but multiple dishwashers. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's why people will do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Barbara, though I can only see the top of your head.
I know I'm on a couch and that's up there. It seems to me that these laws, which Joseph Carl made, were what, the 1600s?
Yeah, we can call it 1600.
And it seems to me like those were laws for then.
Oh, yeah.
Not really for now. I almost think that we're a little more kosher now than he was.
Totally.
Because, I mean, we don't take a vessel and use it the next day.
Right.
My God, there's none of us that are taking a meat vessel and cooking milk in it the next day.
Totally.
No matter what.
You're 100% correct. And
these are outdated laws. I mean, it's crazy, but they don't apply to us.
I've really missed you, Barbara. So they're not,
Thanks.
You're welcome. They're not necessarily outdated, but the part of the reason that I love Halakha is the fact that you're completely correct in that Yosef Karo and his, compatriots were studying and observing a very different type of kashrut, probably because of resources and because of access and all those kinds of things.
And how are they going to when they trape from one place to the next? How are they going to drag milk and meat and 4 sets of dishes?
Right, exactly. So that's like resources and availability and all those kinds of things. And you're right that today we are taking these laws, and that's why some of these are, because they're so specific, it's hard for me to relate them to all of you. They might make sense, but there's no way to really conceptualize them in 2022. The way in which we take these laws is we make stringency so that we don't make mistakes. But ultimately, many of the laws that we're reading, the basics of these laws, if we held by, ben yomo, right, we could have a plate that we use tonight that we also use tomorrow for meat or milk. We just would have to be careful. And we have become, whether it's a lazy people or a more efficient and resourceful people, that we don't do that. We now have separate everythings so that we, A, don't make those mistakes, and B, we don't have to have that much focus on those things.
Right, and that's why Mike is thinking between hot and cold.
Right.
And that's the way we think now. But they maybe didn't think that way back then.
Well, they did think that way in terms. Oh man, went away. Okay.
That was a sneeze.
I got a sneeze, but then I killed it. Rabbi Kligfeld and I, if you ever want to make Rabbi Kligfeld laugh, he is convinced that since I started working at Temple Beth Am, he's never been able to sneeze around me, because whenever he goes to sneeze, I look at him and then it goes away. So if you ever want to make him laugh, you can tell him that I've stolen his sneeze. So yeah, I think that they still were worried about hot and cold back then, because transfer isn't any different, right? We still are worried about the transfer of certain elements in certain kinds of vessels. And so hot transfers, cold does not. And that's how it's been back in the day too. So Mike's point is definitely correct, but I do think that they were concerned about it. It's just a matter of, were they A, as concerned, and B, were they concerned in the same kind of ways that we are concerned, or was it different based on the vessel, based on the timing, etc.? So that's why Mike's question is such a good one, because it's very specific to a very general principle. Okay, Renee and then Joanna, and maybe I'll sneeze at some point.
Look into the light.
Yeah, well,
it'll help you sneeze.
Okay.
2 questions also. One, if someone were to use, let's say, the kli that's used for netilat yadayim.
Yeah.
I mean, not that we cook in it, but if someone were to use that thing for netilat yadayim to cook with, would that be not permissible, because its original intention was for netilat yadayim?
No, because ostensibly you're not using, like, if someone didn't know and they put soup in your netilat yadayim cup, that's fine. I mean, it's now made your netilat yadayim cup meat or milk, but that shouldn't really matter if you continue using it only for your hands.
Also,
yeah.
What if someone is very poor and they can't afford to have, maybe they can only have one pot altogether, maybe
right.
Only one plate. So then what? And maybe it's not glass. Then what allowances are made as far as kashrut for that person?
Yeah. So I would say, similar to my ceramic plates, which cannot be kashered, I would say that the longer you can wait in between use, the better, right? So if someone was so poor that they only had one plate, what I would say is to only eat dairy one day, and then the next day not start eating meat until dinner, and then eat meat for another whole day, and then do the same kind of cycle, right? Such that your plate is rotating, I guess, through those things without any kind of use in between, right? The keeping to the not use of 24 hours is possible.
If they were that poor, they wouldn't be eating meat, period.
Right. I was just going to say that, if you're dealing with someone who is, who is that poor, I think that you're also dealing with just decisions around food in general. Right. We often hear stories about, like, the Holocaust, when people were told that they could either eat pig or not eat, like, you eat pig, right? That's what our Torah says, right? You keep yourself alive. So that obviously has nothing to do with being poor, but it's the similar thing, right? If you are so destitute that you grew up kosher and now you can only afford fast food, well, you eat the protein in fast food, whatever that might be, rather than just French fries, because they might be the most kosher item.
Even if it's treif?
Oh yeah, to keep yourself alive, 100%. I'm sure many of you have heard me tell this story. My uncle, when he first started his chemotherapy, when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I was in rabbinical school, and he told me he lost his appetite, and he told me that he was the only thing he was craving was bacon. And I said to him, I was like, eat it. That like every rabbi in the world would tell you to eat it, right? If nothing else appeals to you and you are not getting any kind of sustenance from any other kind of food and you feel like eating bacon because that's what smells and tastes good to you right now, 100% you should do it. He never did it, and he ate other foods, etc. But for sure, someone would tell you to eat treif before they tell you to eat nothing. So again, it's a little bit of it's one of those questions that when you ask it, it's a little bit hard to answer because it would be very situational in terms of the person and in terms of what they're dealing with. But the answer is yes, you would make sure that the person could eat no matter what and not worry about the kashrut. Joanna.
When Barbara started talking, and then there's been a couple of other comments that also have touched on this in one way or another about trying to contextualize, Rabbi Caro's time and the time and the place where all of this was come up with.
Yeah.
And also, this discussion around resources and what people had available to them. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, this discussion has become much more fascinating to me than it otherwise would have been, because this whole concept of like what you intend to do at the outset versus what might happen in actual reality by accident. Mm-hmm. So when those mistakes happen, right, like if there was no recourse, in essence, what you're telling a person is like, you have to abandon ship and stop keeping kosher. Mm-hmm. And so this whole concept that there is a recourse, there is a way to come back to it, there is a way to get back on course and get back on track, especially in a time where we can assume people had much more limited resources, I think is an incredibly positive message about Kashrut in particular and Judaism in general.
Yeah. I very much agree. And again, it's part of the reason that I love this topic, because even though we from the outset might imagine that it would be very restrictive, in many ways it's actually very eye-opening in the ways in which we are inclusive of those things that we know are important and the things that we should take into consideration, but the loopholes that we have to make sure that this isn't the end all be all, right? That there are ways in which we can be flexible and we can make sure that this is intentional and important, but not, again, the end all be all, right? It's not everything that matters to how we are eating and how we are creating our kitchens. The one thing I'll say, the last thing I'll say, and then we can do one more seif, I think, though I'll look to see how long the next one is. When I talk to students who are converting to Judaism about kashrut, I always say, before we have a conversation about what you can and cannot eat, just remember that kashrut is all about intentionality, right? From the minute that you put food in your mouth to the second that you buy plates and cutlery, it's all about intentionality. It's not about what you can't eat. It's about why you can't eat it or how you're separating yourself from eating something. It's not supposed to be a punishment. It's supposed to be a mindfulness. It's supposed to be a way in which when you look at a menu, you recognize the things that you can eat or you cannot eat, or one step beyond that, there are certain restaurants that you might go to or not go to based on their halachic standards of kashrut. So I think that what the beautiful drash that you just gave, Joanna, that speaks so beautifully to kind of the meaning of kashrut is exactly that, right? The intentionality around it, how we engage with it as a practice and not just stipulations and laws and rules. But, we say blessings over our food. There's a reason for that. So yeah. Okay. Let me see if this next seif is short enough to do. It's one line. We might even be able to do this 2 of them before we go. Okay. All right. So, okay. Okay, Kashem shestam klihem shel avdei kochavim einam b'nei yoman. So just like we think of just stam kalim, like regular kalim that belonged to avdei kochavim, those who believe in the stars, right? Those who are idol worshippers are not b'nei yoman. They haven't been used within the past 24 hours. Kach stam kalim shelanu bechezkat she'einan b'nei yoman. So to our own vessels, right? We presume that they have not been used within 24 hours. So this actually goes more so to how we imagine our kitchens than the way that we're imagining these kitchens of yore. That we have many different plates. And so we imagine that a plate that we might pull off of the shelf today isn't going to be used for another 2, 3, 4, maybe a week, because we have other plates that we can use. So just like we would assume that of someone who isn't Jewish, we should also assume that of someone who is Jewish. So when we're talking about a vessel that might be meat or might be dairy, we should also assume it hasn't been used within 24 hours, because that would be a lot of cooking on the same things or eating on the same things, which we don't assume in anybody's kitchen. I guess even back in this day, we didn't assume based on the way kitchens were set up. Kli shene'asar bevli'at isur, so a vessel that has absorbed some kind of prohibited food, v'nit'arev be'acherim, and has become mixed with other things, ve'eno nikar batel berov. It's not seen to be nullified or canceled out in the majority. So that batel b'shishim, when we were talking about 1/60th, you can't do that here, right? You can't assume that for this kind of mixture. So let me try to give this in more basic terms. A vessel that you by accident either mixed meat and milk in, or somehow some treif got into it, and then it's been mixed with other things, right? It somehow either was a mixture to begin with, or you had a little bit of treif in it, and then you forgot to kasher it, and now you've used it again with something, so it's become kind of mishmashed with other experiences, with other types of foods that have been made. You cannot say, oh, well, that was only a little bit, and now more than a 60th, though it's not giving us that measurement here, but the majority now has not taken over it, because you've now used it twice. You should have kashered it in between. So there's no nullification of majority, because it shouldn't have been used to begin with. Yeah, Mike.
I was reading that totally differently in the English, and I may be completely off base, but
yeah,
it's not. I thought it was not talking about a combination of ingredients that caused it to be isur, but rather that we're given that it's isur, and now we've mixed that utensil or plate with others of like kind, and can't tell which one is the one that was treif, and it's saying that we're not allowed to say that, since it's only a minority of the total number of plates, let's say, that it's okay to use it. Oh,
interesting. It is a different read and with the same outcome. But yeah, it's definitely possible that you mix it in so much so that you can't tell the difference between whether or not it's treif or not treif, or if you use that spoon for the right thing or the wrong thing. But we still shouldn't assume that because of a majority, it's now okay. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure that's quite what I meant.
Okay.
Let's say you have 10 plates, one of them, and let's just assume for now that they could be koshered.
Okay.
And so one of them becomes treif.
Yeah.
You mix it in.
Yeah.
With the other 9 plates.
Right.
And now you want to use all the plates, and you cannot argue that it's only a minority and therefore you can use them all. You must either get rid of the bad one or kosher all of them if you're not sure.
Correct. So if we're talking about vessels and not about food, that's a great example, right? I think I used an example of hot dogs that Rabbi Alexander gave us a while ago, right? That if you have 600 hot dogs and a batch of unkosher hot dogs got mixed in that would be less than the majority, can you still eat all the hot dogs not knowing which one is going to be kosher? No, you have to assume that they're all treif. So that's the same thing that Mike is saying, that if you have a bunch of, we'll use his language, a bunch of plates, one of them you didn't kosher after an experience where you should have koshered it, you can't assume that, oh, well, it's okay, I'm not going to know which one it was, and I'll use the rest of the plates as if that was, it's now, quote, nullified. No, you have to kosher then all of the plates because you need to make sure that they're all fit for use. So kosher your plate. Don't skip out on that step. But that's a great example for vessels. I was reading it as if we're talking about food here, but that the isur is the food that made the vessel unusable. But it's possible that we're talking about the vessel itself then becoming an isur. That's a very very compelling read. So you might be totally correct. And we have the same outcome, which is you either can't eat the food or you can't use the plate unless you kosher it. So they're both prohibited to you. Let me see what this chat is, and then Josh. Okay, we'll read this last thing from Josh Molina because he's the son of a congregant, and we'll give him that zchut. Okay, Josh Molina was once asked in an interview why he keeps kosher. I loved his response and transcribed and saved it. It reminds me who I am 3 times a day, which is to say, a Jew. It is something I have done all my life. Good job, Bob Molina. It is one of my prime identifiers. It also, to a certain extent, makes the act of eating, which is an integral part of every day, holy. Yep, it makes me more thankful for food in general, just being mindful. It is a great experiment in mindfulness. Yeah, I 100% agree with that statement, and I think that's exactly what kashrut is for. It's how all of these rules of kashrut also come to being in terms of why we keep them and what that separation is all about. So a beautiful quote to end on. Next week will be a surprise. I'm going to look to see what comes next in here. If we're staying in the weeds and all these kinds of examples, I might move us on to another topic if that's okay with everybody. You're all nodding. Okay. So we'll move on to a different topic. But what I might have us do is skip to a different topic completely and then go back to kashrut closer to Passover, and have us kind of do a little bit of a refresher closer to Passover. So I'll keep you posted. We will have class. Oh, we won't have class. Next week we won't have class because I have a board meeting. So once a month I'm not going to be able to have class because of board meetings. So we won't have class next week, but we will the week after. And I will make sure that goes out and that you can remember.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.